Good evening, everyone. How are we doing this evening? Enjoying the heat? All right, my name's John Geib. I'm a master gardener. I took the compost specialist training here this year, and this is part of my programs to help disseminate some of the information that I received out to the public. I've been a master gardener for about 10 years now, and so I've always had a real good passion for composting. So it was kind of fun to go spend my birthday going to go learn about composting for 3 days. So, okay, we're going to be talking about three things tonight. Do a real brief overview of composting in general and some of the things that we have to worry about here. But the main focus that we're going to try and work on a little bit today is what's called vermiculture, or composting with worms. And then we'll get into a discussion about some compost tea, which is something a lot of people have had questions about, and I can finally get some good information for them. So, now one of the things that I've run into when we start talking about compost, most of the people that write the books on compost, if you go look for literature, are either in the Pacific Northwest or in the Northeast, where they get like 4 times as much rainfall as we do. Okay, so while the basics for the compost may work, a lot of the particulars that we have to fight with, especially our low humidity and hot sun, they don't have to deal with at all. And so a lot of the ways that they do the composting doesn't quite work for us. But that's more of a little bit of methodology in there. The other big problem that I've found is they aren't trained people that have any actual knowledge. They've actually just discussed how they've done it and do it through anecdotal evidence with a little bit of science brought in here and there. And because of that, a lot of times they mix some of the ideas, like whether it's hot composting, cold composting, do you have to turn it, not turn it, and all this sort of stuff. And so you don't get a lot of good information from the books. So that's one of the reasons why we've been putting these on, especially here in West Texas. Now, if you're looking for a really good in-depth discussion of compost, our YouTube channel, as you can see, I'm videotaping this one here tonight. I have been videotaping these for the past 2 years now. I have a couple of presentations talking strictly about compost, and a lot of it, they're at least an hour long, and so they got into a lot of really good in-depth information. So if you want to go take a look at those videos at your leisure, you can. I'm just going to kind of hit the highlights as we move through right now. When we're talking compost, all we're talking about is the decomposition of organic material into what we call humus. Okay, we're usually using insects, bacteria, fungi to help work on this process to take any of these organic materials and break them down and make them into this soil-like material that we're looking for. The one key thing that we're doing as home composters, though, we're looking for aerobic decomposition, which is decomposition in the presence of oxygen. If you do anaerobic decomposition and composting, that's without oxygen. You'll find that a lot of times in buckets of water, you know, the sludge at the bottom of it. And you notice how nice and smelly that is, that good rotten egg smell that you get out of that. That's not what we're looking for at home composting. I mean, it works the same for us effectively. It produces the same end result, but it's just a lot more odors and a lot more issues that we have to worry about with that. When we're talking about the humus, we're looking for the end results is basically a lot of nutrients in that material. It also has a lot of carbon and nitrogen in it that is helpful for the plants to go ahead and grow, which is one thing we're really looking at doing. Also has a lot of organic material in it. This organic material, especially in our soils, will help aerate the soil if we're in the clay soil. If it's up in the more sandy areas north of town, a lot of times that organic material will help hold on to the moisture a little bit longer instead of letting it just drain straight through. Organic material is pretty much anything that was alive. The only caveat I put on that is alive within the last couple centuries, because I always have that one person in the audience goes, but oil was made from dinosaurs, which was living, and so can we decompose? No. It's strictly organic material that's recently been alive. Anything will decompose, doesn't matter what it is. Woods, human, remains, animal remains, bug remains, anything will decompose eventually. The one big problem that we have here, though, is our moisture contents, especially in spring when we're running, 8% humidity and 45-mile-an-hour winds. It can suck the moisture out of a compost pile in a matter of hours. And so that's one of our big problems here. Without that moisture in the material that we're trying to decompose, we don't get any decomposition. We just get a dehydration of that material, and it doesn't decompose. It just sits there, which is why you can go to deserts of like Egypt and find, mummies and stuff that have been around for 1,000 years, because they've just dried out and they haven't decomposed at all. So the main thing that we can do as home composters to help with this decomposition process is to go ahead and organize it and keep things contained so that the wind's not blowing it around, so we can kind of keep it where we want it and make sure the moisture stays in that pile. When we're talking compost, we usually break things down into two basic components, either the browns or the greens. The browns are high carbon items. The greens are high nitrogen items. Both are critically required for decomposition. We're looking for about a 1-to-1 mix on those to get a good decomposition rate. Got some examples of stuff that count as browns. A lot of yard trimmings and a lot of our yard waste can go in as a brown for the compost pile. And as long as it's not a fresh yard waste, it can count as a brown. We can use anything from wood chips to branches to grass clippings. All the junk mail that you get during the year, that's one of the best things I found for compost piles. Best use for it I found. Pull off the plastic labels, throw the rest of it in the compost pile. Yes, sir.
So the inks and the colors?
For the most part, the inks anymore are now vegetable-based inks, and so they decompose with no problem straight into the soil, and you never notice it. So they aren't any problems with being poisonous for the soil. Yes, ma'am.
Do you need to worry about like weed seeds in your grass?
I'll talk to about that in a minute. Some other brown things that are kind of a little bit off the scale that most people don't think about, things like dryer lint. It's a nice, good source of brown material, except you have to make sure it's coming from strictly organic source. So, and when I say organic material. So straight 100% cotton, 100% wool, silk, that sort of thing. Something that's not got any polyester or nylon in it. Okay, so you don't want those plastics in there. Those plastics will break down, but they don't actually decompose, and you end up with microplastics in your soil, which they've been starting to do some studies on that are definitely showing that it's not beneficial for us. So, untreated wood products, this is the key thing on it, untreated wood products. Pressure-treated products contain some chemicals that you don't want to put into your soil. Copper is one of them. If you're dealing with older pressure-treated lumber, maybe some that you've pulled off of an old structure, a lot of that can actually contain things like arsenic, so stuff you really don't want to put into your compost pile. So just be careful to make sure that it is good, fresh, healthy wood products. Greens can be mostly green stuff. So we're talking green leaves, green grass, weeds without seeds. Especially, so if you let your grass grow a little bit too much and it goes to seed, I would not recommend putting that bag of grass clippings into your compost pile. It will go ahead and decompose. The problem is, unless you are really diligent on getting your compost pile hot enough, those weed seeds will germinate. And Bermuda grass seed in your compost pile is one of the worst things you'll ever run into, because you'll never get rid of it. Any of your food products, veggies, veggie scraps, that sort of stuff work real well. Coffee grounds and tea bags work real well. Now, when we're talking tea bags, a lot of times you've got that staple in them, so you probably don't want to. You want to go ahead and probably pull that staple out before you throw it in the compost pile. The metal in it will actually decompose and rust out, but it can poke you if you got your hands in the soil if it hasn't decomposed also. but a lot of times the staples will actually contain a plastic coating on it that you don't want to put into your soil. Yes, ma'am?
Take the tag off the banana skin.
Take the tag.
The tag off the banana skin.
Yeah, the tag off the banana skin. It's plastic or at least a very heavy waxed coated type paper, so it won't absorb any moisture. How many of y'all have fur babies? Yeah. Get a couple of fur babies extra a week, running around your house. Throw those in the compost pile. It's one of the really good source for nitrogen for your compost pile. Okay. Yeah, exactly. It's finding uses for these things that you're trying to get rid of a lot of times. And the nice part about it is most of the nitrogen sources, like grass clippings and whatnot, once they dry out, they lose a lot of their nitrogen source. Okay, so that's why grass clippings go from being a green if they're a green source and nitrogen source when they're fresh, to once they dry out, they become a brown. Okay, because they're more carbon based at that point. But hair has a tendency to keep that nitrogen locked up. And so you can go ahead and store it as long as it's nice and dry. You can store it for a while without losing any of the nitrogen out of it. So it's kind of a good source for it. If you've got a hobby of making like beer or wine, any of the leftovers makes wonderful nitrogen sources also for your compost. Yes, sir?
Eggs, do you have to do anything with the eggshell?
Eggshells you can go ahead and put in. I would advise crunching them down. The smaller they are, the faster they'll decompose. In fact, usually what I do is I actually have a little small coffee grinder that I bought that's strictly for eggshells. And I'll grind it and powder it. That way.
Wash them at all before you do that? Or?
No, I just kind of grind them through and throw them into the compost pile. Let them go. Manures, we're talking manure from vegetarian style animals. So we're looking at horses, cows, goats, sheep, alpacas, llamas, that sort of thing. Work well. Chicken manure is also very good. I'll talk a little bit about some of the problems with some of the manures here in a minute. Blood and bone meal, if you've got any extra, say you've got a bag of bone meal or something that you had been using for fertilizer that got wet and got solidified, just take it and toss it into your compost pile, break it up a little bit. That's an extra source for nitrogen into your pile. If you've got horses or any animals that eat hay, any of that hay, especially alfalfa that has gone moldy and you can't feed it to your animals, toss it in your compost pile. It's a good source for nitrogen there. Fish meal and emulsion, one of the key things with that to think about is it stinks. So it may attract a lot of pests that you don't want in your compost pile, like rats and other things. There is an entire section on composting where you use urine as the liquid source. I'm not going to get into that. If you want to do it, feel free. Do your research. But urine is very high in ammonia, which has a lot of nitrogen in it. So it actually does work pretty well. Things to avoid. Diseased weeds, diseased plants and weeds, weeds with seeds. The big thing on the diseased plants is tomatoes a lot of times. Tomatoes are notorious for getting mosaic wilt and vericillium wilt. And you don't want to put those into your compost pile. You want to just dispose of those in the trash. Those viruses stay in the soil unless you're extremely diligent in getting it hot enough, and it's not worth the effort. Just go ahead and toss those to the side and go ahead and go without. Wood ash, a lot of people talk about putting wood ash into your compost pile to add some potassium into it. You can put a little bit in. I'd recommend just doing it as a fertilizer later in the garden, not doing it in the actual compost itself. Fish, meat, and dairy can be put into your compost pile, usually in very small amounts, but this goes back with what we were talking about, fish emulsion. It does stink. It does have that possibility of attracting some critters into your compost pile that you don't want, but it does decompose, so it's not a big deal. I did a compost pile a couple years ago where we harvested out a couple of chickens, and all of the leftover remains from the chickens all went into the compost pile. Now, this was a very large compost pile. I was able to dig down several feet into it, bury it with a whole bunch of shredded paper, and then bury it again with a whole, more shredded paper on top, and then covered it with about 2 feet of unfinished compost on top of that, and I didn't have any smells. And it decomposed really, really quick because it was a very high nitrogen source. So, but it's one of those things. Most people don't want to try and deal with it because of the pests. Oils are going to be the same thing. They're going to go rancid a lot of times before they actually decompose and bring in some smells. So you want to be careful with those when you're putting them in the compost pile. Yes, ma'am.
What happens if you lose a squash plant to that nasty bug? Is that on the safety plan?
No. Squash bugs, when they're doing it, while they are spreading diseases a lot of times, most of the damage that they do is just sucking the leaves dry, and so it's not a big problem there. And a lot of the diseases that you get between squash plants aren't usually that persistent, as opposed to some of the varicillium wilt and mosaic virus type stuff. Things to avoid, of course, anything non-organic, plastics, metal, glass, that sort of stuff. Any chemically treated wood. This would also include wood that's been painted. You probably want to get the paint off of it before you throw it in there, just in case. Charcoal products. A lot of people will talk about throwing in their charcoal remains into it. The problem is that most of the charcoal products these days have lighter fluid in them. And even after they've burned, they still have a little bit of residual lighter fluid in them. So you don't really want to put that into your compost pile. Any of the sides, herbicides, pesticides, vermicides, fungicides, that sort of stuff can do a lot of damage into your compost pile. Things like the fungicides and the vermicides can kill off some of the processes in the compost pile itself. A lot of the herbicides will actually persist through your compost process and be still active when you put it into your garden. That's one of the big problems that we've run into. When we talked about the vegetarian manures, these are the 3 biggies that you don't want to put into your compost pile: dog, cat, and pig manure. Okay, these are close enough physiologically that we don't want to have to worry about any viruses spreading from the manure into the human population. So it's one of those things they really do not recommend any of those manures going into your compost pile. So now, pardon?
That's not a problem.
Yeah. I do have had people that they will make their own separate pile, compost pile, that they will use things like to get rid of their dog manure, to go ahead and do a compost pile that's strictly that, but that compost strictly goes onto their flower gardens as opposed to their vegetable gardens. So it's one way to go ahead and do it. Just have to remember that that can't be used where human food is going to be grown. Glossy paper and wax paper, the main problem with those is they don't absorb moisture. And if they don't absorb the moisture, they aren't going to go ahead and decompose. One thing I've found, if you do sodas or anything like that, you get the big boxes of sodas with the nice pretty wrappings on them, with the product name on it. The cardboard inside will decompose. That coloring on the outside is not ink. It is a thin plastic coating. And so what you'll do is you'll throw all this chunks of cardboard into the compost pile, and you'll come back and you'll find these little pieces of, in my case, since, I drink green, little green pieces of plastic in my compost pile. So I found that out the hard way.
How about rabbit?
Rabbit manure is good. It doesn't even need to be composted, and you can just go ahead and scatter that in the vegetable garden. So, some precautions you want to think about. We are dealing with a pile of bacteria and all sorts of other stuff. So we want to make sure that we do things like keep our tetanus shots up to date. Most people do not remember the last time they got their tetanus shot. I've found that it's very handy to pick a date that you will remember always. The year of your anniversary, a 0 year or a 5 year, something like that. And remember and get your tetanus on that year. And then you can remember every 10 years to go ahead and get a new tetanus shot. My son turns 30 next year. I'm due for a new tetanus shot. That's how I remember when I need my new tetanus shots. If you go in and you do get a nasty wound and stuff, a lot of times the doctors will still give you a tetanus booster whether you need it or not. But it's kind of nice to know that you don't really need one unless you have to. Any cuts and stuff like that you might have, go ahead and make sure you keep those covered. Keep them clean when you do get finished with your compost pile. Try and wear gloves so anything that might stick you won't actually go through the glove, hopefully. If you're going to go ahead and turn your compost pile, make sure you sprinkle it with water, kind of knock down some of that dust, because remember there's a lot of molds and stuff, and that dust when it gets kicked up can really suck into your lungs, and you really don't want to breathe that. So go ahead and sprinkle it down with some water to kind of knock some of that dust out before you go ahead and turn it. If you've got a mold allergy like I do, I wear a very good respirator. I actually use a paint mask a lot of times when I'm doing turning my compost pile, because if I don't, I actually end up with asthma attacks. When you're done, make sure you scrub your hands with soap and hot water to get all that compost and all the bacteria off your hands. Once you put your compost into your garden, remember that all that bacteria is in your soil now, and so you want to make sure that any vegetables that you're pulling out, especially root crops or anything that's low-hanging or sitting on the ground, you want to make sure you wash it off thoroughly before you go ahead and eat it. When we're talking compost fragrances, there shouldn't be any. A good, well-maintained compost pile will actually not smell at all, except maybe just a little bit of an earthy smell. If you do get some fragrances, it means you've either got a spot that's too wet or is compacted down and it's lost all the oxygen. So all you really need to do is go ahead and just turn it up a little bit, loosen it up, and maybe add a little bit of extra shredded paper or something like that to help absorb some of that moisture. So, let's see, what else is there? When we're looking at moisture content, we're looking at about 50% moisture. The easy way to remember that, think of coffee grounds. Use coffee grounds straight off of the coffee pot. They don't drip anything anymore. They're fully saturated. But, if you squeeze them, you'll get moisture out of it. And that's about what we're looking for in the compost pile. A little dry is okay, but we still want to get as much moisture as we can out of that compost pile as possible. Vermicides, when we were talking manures earlier, sheep are especially notorious for this, sometimes cattle also. They will use dewormers to go ahead and flush the worms out of their system, while that vermicide that has gone through the cow and the sheep will be in the manure. And so that will end up in your compost pile, so you want to be careful of that. The other, if you're going to go ahead and use some of that, you go ahead and just leave it out, let it sit for a couple of months before you actually throw it into your compost pile. That'll help kind of burn off some of the vermicides in it. Broadleaf herbicides are the really big problem we run into with compost piles. Horses are notorious for getting this problem into our compost pile. Most people will feed just simple hay to their horses. Problem is, most hay fields are sprayed with broadleaf weed killer to kill off all the weeds. And that weed killer, when it goes through a horse, does not get processed at all. If anybody that owns horses understands that what goes into a horse pretty much is the same stuff that comes out of the horse, with very little processing in between. And so that broadleaf herbicide will end up in your manure, which can end up in your compost pile. And for the most part, the compost process will not break down that herbicide. And so you'll end up with broadleaf weed killer in your compost. And it can stay there for up to 3 years. And so it's something you really want to try and avoid. Now, if the person you're getting your horse manure from is feeding their horse organic feed of any sort, that'll work. Or if they're just on open pasture where they haven't been sprayed at all, that'll work also. Careful when you worry about it. Organic's useful. The one problem that we run into with chicken manure is high in salts, which can be an issue for us. So we want to go ahead and make sure that we be real careful with how much chicken manure we're using. But chicken manure is some of the highest nitrogen sources that we can actually find. So it's kind of a trade-off on, do we want the high nitrogen source and worry about the salts later. So some manure doesn't need composting. she asked about rabbits. Rabbits is one. Alpacas and llamas are the two other ones that really don't need composting. Goats and sheep are close, but you probably should go ahead and compost those if possible. Any questions on composting or in general? Okay. Give me a second. Okay. Vermiculture is basically farming worms. It's basically what it boils down to. You're trying to raise worms so that you can end up with the worm castings, which is their manure, and that way you can go ahead and put that in your plants and garden areas so that they can fertilize your garden area. It's a reasonably cheap process to get into. You can do it for probably about $10 to $15. You can get your worm farm started up. And after that, the material to go into the worm farm is pretty much free because it's all food scraps or paper products that you've got around the house that you're trying to get rid of anyhow. It's pretty easy. The worms take care of themselves. You throw them some food every once in a while, you're good. You know, and that's just give them a nice, reasonably decent home, and they're good. You can actually do this indoors. In fact, it's preferable for most people to do it indoors. Outdoors here, it gets a little hot for most of your worm bins, unless you're using like an old freezer or something like that, where it's got an insulated box that they can work from. When we're talking worms, worms are cold-blooded invertebrates. Because they are cold-blooded, that means they can't regulate their body temperatures. That means they need to stay in roughly the same conditions that they like all the time, and you have to provide that. One of the good things about that is what the temperatures that they like, you also like for the most part. They're looking at temperatures usually between 50 and 85 degrees is their ideal temperature range. And so anything inside our house is usually what they're going to be enjoying very much. Their nature, they don't dig deep in the soil. They're usually in the top foot or so of soil, and usually a lot of times the top 6 inches. They like leaf litter. They like manure piles. Anything that's decomposing, they like to go ahead and get into that. And so that's what we're trying to represent when we're doing our composting with the worms. Worms themselves do not have teeth. They do have a mouth, so they do get to gum food. Because they don't have teeth, they can't really chew off anything. They kind of mouth it and kind of swallow it down. So any of the food that they are eating, they are actually trying to eat some of the softened material off of that food. So if you toss it a piece of steak, it's going to have to wait a little bit until that steak starts to break down naturally before they can actually start chewing it up and disposing of it properly. They are hermaphroditic, which means they carry both sex organs on their body, but they do need a separate worm. You do need 2 worms to go ahead and mate together because they will swap between them. Okay, so it's kind of one of those interesting things. Mature worms will have what we call the clitellum, which is this band right here that you'll see. So if you'll see an earthworm or something going around, you'll see that little big fat band. That tells you that the worm is old enough to be reproduce. That's actually where it carries all of its reproductive organs, is in that band. So now, when we're talking earthworms, those are not the ones we want to do for vermiculture. They work well in your garden, but they do not work well in captivity. So that's one of the big problems that you run into. You actually have to buy your worms, usually from online sources. Occasionally you can buy them at stores like bait shops and stuff like that, but you just got to make sure that you're getting the right types. There are 2 basic types that you want to get. One is either a red wiggler or a red tiger worm. Red tiger worms are a little bit harder to find. Not that they're any better or anything. It's just they aren't quite as, most people don't seem to use them as much. The red wigglers are very easy to grow, it seems like, and so that the main sources have a tendency to switch over to the red wigglers all the time. They are a little light red in color to a maroon. If we're talking the red tigers, they actually are a little bit striped. So if you look at these worms here, they do actually have a little bit of striping on them. Not much, but a little bit, and that's where they get their name from. When they are adults, they're only about 2 to 4 inches long. Okay, so we're not talking very large worms. Okay, what's kind of neat though is when you do see have a worm farm going for a while, is to see the really small worms. You know, we're talking, you know, ½ inch or smaller, and sitting there going through. It's kind of neat to see the life cycle as they run through their reproduction cycle and grow as a colony.
Can you mix the 2 worms together, or do you have to keep the beds separate?
No, you can, like I said, earthworms is the only one you don't want to worry about. The other ones, doesn't matter. You can go ahead and just fit, as long as it's either of those 2 breeds, you can just kind of put them in. It's not going to hurt anything.
Is the red wiggler better than for this climate, or?
The red wigglers and the red tigers will both work here. Like I said, we're trying to keep the environment pretty close to what we're used to, so that's the only thing. You know, they both like that type of an environment, so it works well for them. So they like dark material. You know, remember where they come from. They like that top couple inches of soil, so they like dark areas. They like moist areas. Okay, they breathe through their skin, through a mucus layer on their skin. So if they get too dry, they'll actually suffocate. Okay, so we want to make sure that we've gotten lots of nice moisture for them. That 50 to 60% moisture range, again, just like we want with a regular compost pile, that's what we want for the red wigglers. They like it to be a nice aerated type soil. So usually a lot of times we'll start with shredded paper as a base layer to start our colony with, because it can be nice and fluffy, and they like that. They like being able to move in and out of it very nicely. The other big thing about it is they don't like vibrations. A lot of people will put their worm colonies up underneath the sink, which is a good place for it. It's cool, it's dark. Excuse me. It's cool, it's dark. It's a reasonably humid environment because it's in our house, in kind of an enclosed area in the kitchen. The one problem is people that have garbage disposals and will run the garbage disposals, and that vibration will annoy the worms, and they will try and leave. So if you make it too much vibration in the area, they're going to run away. So, and you don't want them running around through your house. So temperature range, like I said, 50 to 85, 65 to 70 is what is their ideal range though. So they'll be able to mate and reproduce and get lots more worms for you if you keep the conditions reasonably what they like. So keeping it dark, keeping it moist, lots of food, and a couple of worms so that they can actually find the other worm that they like to have more babies with. So yeah, it doesn't take much for them. I said temperature is going to be the key thing on that, temperature and food. If there's plenty of food, they'll keep reproducing as long as the temperature is right. So they will try and crawl out of the containment that you have them in if it's too wet or too dry. So those are the 2 big ones that most people have to worry about, unless you've got vibration issues that you're going to have to worry about. And then that's the other one that they really try and run away from. So now, when we're talking about getting into the worms, first place you need to figure out where you're going to do it. A lot of people will do it in places like closets or kitchens even, because especially in kitchens, it's nice and handy. You cut up all your food scraps for the day and just toss it into the worm bin. You don't have to worry about it. It's real nice. If you're going to do outside, inside, key thing is you want an opaque box of some sort. Plastic works very well. Styrofoam also works well. So either of those will work best. You need about 2 foot by 2 foot by about 12 inches deep as a good starter box. You're going to need about 1 square foot of space per person for your average food scraps is what it usually boils down to be. So if you've got about a four square foot area, 2 foot by 2 foot, you can probably take the kitchen scraps from about 4 people and go ahead and keep that worm colony happy. So if you've got a solid box like a plastic box or a styrofoam box, you're going to want to put some holes in the bottom of it and then put a tray underneath of that. This will allow any excess moisture. If you get too much water in there, it'll go ahead and drain out, and that way it won't drown your worms, because they can drown also. Indoor locations, they're convenient. You're going to want them preferably closer to your kitchen if possible, although nearby will work too. You may just have to keep your food scraps kind of like in a bowl for a couple days if you want to just kind of set it out in like a laundry area or something you don't go to very often. You want to avoid direct sunlight. This will, not only do they not like the light, but that direct sunlight will heat up in the container over the course of the day, and then it'll cool off. So those fluctuating temperatures, the worms aren't going to really like it a whole lot. You want to try and keep it away from the vibration. So like I said, garbage disposals is one thing. The other one is like washing machines a lot of times. A lot of people will put it in their laundry room, but they just got to make sure it's not right next to the laundry machine itself, because of the vibration when it goes into the spin cycle. It can vibrate the boxes a bit. Garages work well. The only problem with them around here is that they get really, really hot in the summer and can get really cold in the winter. So you're going to want to probably have more of an insulated box if you're going to put it into the garage. A lot of times I've seen people that will use old refrigerators or old freezers. They'll peel the seals off of them. One of the things with Texas, you're not allowed to have a refrigerator or anything where the door can close and trap a kid into it. And so a lot of times what you can do is you can just peel the seal off, and the lid is easily openable at that point. So you can put like a small chest freezer, peel the seal off of it, and it's got a nice insulated box in there. And so the temperatures will regulate themselves pretty well. You just need to add a couple of holes in the bottom to let any moisture drain through. Like I said, under sinks work well, closets work well, laundry areas can work pretty good as long as you're away from the washing machine. So if you're going to go ahead and do your bin setup, go ahead and drill a bunch of holes in the bottom. You don't have to put any mesh or anything over the bottom holes usually. If you don't want to, you can, but that's up to you. On the top side, you usually want to go ahead and put a couple extra holes. Yeah, this is an environment where we do have living animals, so we want to make sure that they have oxygen into it. So we want to go ahead and put some holes on the side so we can get a little bit of an oxygen breeze through there. But we want to try and cover those up usually with like some window screen so that we don't get any flies, fruit flies, that sort of stuff into the food scraps that we might have in there and cause other issues. When we're talking about preparing the bed to get ready for the worms to go into, we want to go ahead and fill it probably with about 6 inches of shredded paper. We want to get it nice and moist and soaked down. If you don't get it soaked down, it kind of dries out the worm. So you want it nice and wet, but not dripping out too much. You're going to want to add a couple of cups of worms. Okay, this is quarter of a pound of worms, something along those lines. Just enough to make sure that they can go ahead and get enough to really eat a fair amount of food. That's the thing. Yes, ma'am.
And what about the glue, like on envelopes? Is that okay or not okay to put in there?
Shouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
Yeah. If it's wet enough, it'll kind of lose its gluiness, and so that's not a problem for it. So, once you go ahead and add the worms into your bed of nice moist paper, as long as you've got some light on it, they will just kind of go ahead and bury themselves into the paper, and you won't see them again, okay, until you start digging through there. They'll bury themselves and start eating. It'll take them a couple of days to go ahead and get used to that environment before they really start eating, so you want to probably let them go about a week or so, just kind of munching on the paper, because they will eat the paper. And then go ahead and add your first week's worth of food scraps into it. Usually most people will start when they feed them, feed one side this week and then feed on the other side the next week, and then they'll just kind of rotate back and forth so that they can kind of keep the worms going back and forth. A lot of times, like I said, the food needs to decompose a little bit on its own to get it a little soft and mushy. And so the food that you put here this week, they probably won't eat this week. They'll be eating last week's food over here. Okay, so as soon as this kind of starts breaking down a little bit, they'll move over and start eating it. And then you can just kind of keep back and forth. There's a couple of pictures of how to do it. Just showing you, make sure it's nice and moist, shred it up. This one, because it's outside, they're actually using leaves also. I don't recommend leaves if you're doing it inside, because you never know what might be on the leaves themselves in the way of critters and eggs from critters, which you don't want to bring into your house. So drop your worms in, let them go ahead on to town doing stuff. When you're talking about your food sources, we want to go ahead and chop up the food. The smaller the better. If you want to actually run it through a blender, that would be really good for them. You don't have to, but it liquefies it pretty much, and so it's a lot easier for them to, all that decomposition I was talking about that kind of needs to happen. If you hit it through a blender, it's already done. They've already got it all mushed up and it's kind of liquidy for them. Try not to keep feeding them in the same spot, because the food will kind of pile up. So like I said, you want to kind of alternate ends of the box that you want to feed them in. If you have extra food, that you've got a worm bin that's eating, 2 pounds of food a week, and you come up to like Thanksgiving and you end up with like an 8-pound pile of food scraps, they're not going to be able to eat that because they're used to eating a couple of pounds a week. And so it's going to take a little while for them to work their way through that. So best bet is to probably go ahead and throw it in the freezer. Throw it in a Ziploc baggie, seal it up, toss it in the freezer, and then kind of pull it out as you can so that you can go ahead and feed them out slowly over a couple of weeks. When you do feed them, go ahead and pull some of the bedding off to the side a little bit, add your food scraps in, and then cover it back up with the paper. This will help eliminate any flies that do get into your food source, or the worm bin will not be able to get to the food sources, and so they won't be able to lay any eggs or anything like that. A lot of additions that they like. They like pretty much anything that we like. There are a few that they don't like. That's the key things on this. Okay, well, let's go through some of these. Basic food scraps work well. Every once in a while, you may want to add a little bit of sand to your project. Every 6 months, just a little sprinkling of sand or powdered dirt onto it. The key thing on that is it helps add a little bit of grit into their system, and so that they usually, a lot of times off of the food, you can get enough of it. But every once in a while, especially if you've noticed they've slowed down a little bit, you may want to add a little bit of sand to help them with their digestive process. Eggshells, I recommend you crush them up really good before you feed them in. Those have to sit there and soften up a lot before the worms can actually break them down. That's one of the big problems with eggshells in worms. If you're outside, you can do things like manures and stuff like that and throw that into your worm bin. I would not recommend that on the indoor ones. So chop everything up. The smaller, the better. This one, he's feeding a lot of scraps into that small little worm bin. So I'd be a little wary on that, but depends on how many worms he's got in there. I don't think he's got enough though. Like I said, it kind of breaks down a little bit beforehand before they'll actually start eating it, because they don't have any teeth, so they're just kind of gumming it. Same thing goes with meat and dairy products that we did for compost. It has a tendency to go rancid, and so you don't really want to put those too much in there. Otherwise, you might get some smells coming out of your worm bin. They will eat it. It's just going to take a little bit longer. Big thing to worry about is really smelly stuff like onions. A lot of times they won't eat your onions, especially raw onions. Citrus a lot of times because it adds a lot of acidity to the soil and to the mixture. And broccoli for some reason. I don't know why. I would think they would like broccoli because it's nice and soft most of the time. But there's enough of an odor to it that they don't, a lot of times the worms won't like it as much. So, of course, avoid any chemicals going into your worm bin, especially those that might kill off all the worms, like vermicides. When you're talking, mention the 3 biggies that we don't want to feed them, but there are other things that your worms may not like. You may feed it to them and they'll be like, I'm not touching that. So, you learn, every once in a while you'll learn something that, they don't really like this the way I produce it. So, you can't feed it to them. It's just one of those things that you've got new pets now, so you just got to learn what they like. So, be able to just sit there and enjoy learning the experience of having a new pet. That's kind of a different one that most people don't like. So, like I said, manures you can go ahead and use in there if you're doing an outdoor bin. But remember that if you do, make sure that they do not have any vermicides in it. So, where are we at? If your bin becomes too wet, you've added a lot of watermelon rind or something like that, and it seems to be getting a little wet, leaking out the bottom a bit, go ahead and add some extra shredded paper, just dry shredded paper, to help soak up some of that moisture. Solves a lot of the problems there. If you're getting a little bit too dry, add a little bit of extra either moisture in the way of water, or just add some fruits or veggies that you have that are a little bit more wet, like watermelon or tomato or something along those lines. You don't want to have any standing water in your bins. That's why we do the holes in the bottom, but also if we've got that tray underneath, you still can end up with water holding in the bottom of that. So you want to try and keep an eye on that to make sure that you aren't getting too much moisture into your bin. Drying it out, we've already talked about. Any odors, shouldn't have too many odors coming from it. The stuff that you are putting in there is getting buried under a little bit of a layer of paper, so that should hold most of it. But there will be occasional little bit of smells from it, but it's not too much to worry about. Most people will keep a lid on their worm bin. One, it keeps the flies off of it, and two, it keeps any odors that do form from getting out too much. Talked about all of these already.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
When do you take out the perfectly composted dirt?
Yes, the worm castings.
Okay.
Yeah. Once it's gotten to the point where most of your bin is soil looking, or the worm castings, there's a couple of ways you can work on this. You can feed only on one end of your worm bin for a couple of weeks. Maybe like this corner of the worm bin and this corner of the worm bin, you kind of alternate, leaving this end open. And so all the worms will kind of travel over to that end, and then you can go ahead and scoop out the worm castings from this side. And that's one way to do it. The other way is to go ahead and pull it, just kind of scoop in and then sift through to kind of pull the worms out. If you end up with extra worms that you end up in your worm castings that you spread out on your garden soil, those worms will eventually die. They don't really like the usual garden environment that we end up around here. They usually don't last very long. So, but yes, ma'am.
How do you use the worm castings? Do you just put them around your plant?
You can put them around your plant. It's basically like a compost. It's very high in nitrogen sources and other nutrients for your plants. You can use it either strictly as like a top dressing. You can mix it into the soil, or you can make it into compost tea, which we're about to talk about.
Can you use that on your inside plants as well?
Yes, works well in the inside plants. And the nice thing about using it for the inside plants, there's no smell for it. So you can just kind of do a little top dressing on all your indoor plants and give them a little bit of fertilizer.
Is there a ratio that you should use, like brown versus green, how much you should put of each?
Doesn't matter for worms. Worms just eat whatever. So
But we to get the perfect one to be good for your.
they'll eat whatever's there. So they aren't worried about it, brown or green. Yes, sir.
Situated, we have too many worms.
Yeah, like I said, they will keep reproducing as long as there's enough food source for them. The problem is that once it gets to a certain point, you're going to have too many worms and not enough food. And so some of them will die off, and you'll have to, and the rest of them will keep going. So that's when you usually kind of want to go ahead and separate out, maybe start a second worm bin, or share some with a friend. Teach them how to do some worm composting. So, any other questions on worms? Okay, compost tea. We've been getting a lot of questions about compost tea recently. And one of the nice things about it is, compost tea has been used. They've dated stuff back millennia on how long compost tea has actually been used in growing plants. The problem that we've always been running into is there was no literature that said anything scientific about why we would use it or why not. Everybody knew why we used it, but nobody actually had any literature that stated why. So there's been no scientific research on it until about 2000. And since 2000, the number of papers and scientific research on compost tea has just absolutely exploded, almost exponentially in the last 10 or 12 years especially. Basically what compost tea is taking compost and extracting some of the nutrients out of it through water. Okay, so we're using a compost as the tea, like in a tea bag, and trying to get the tea out so we can use the tea and get some of those nutrients out. When we're looking at compost tea, there's two things that we can look at. There's both a compost tea or a compost extract. The key difference on those is how strong the liquid is when we get done with it. Compost tea is a little bit weaker, doesn't have quite as much solids in it from the compost itself, but it can be used a lot more as like a foliar spray, which we'll talk about here in a second on why you want to use it. The extract is a little bit stronger in nutrient levels, but it has a lot more of the actual compost in it. The thing, we can't really use that as a foliar spray because it'll actually burn the leaves a little bit. But it does have a lot higher nutrient level, so a lot of times we'll be using an extract more as for regenerating soil. Now, to get the difference on it, when we do a tea, we're taking the compost in a bag and kind of soaking it like we would a normal tea bag. When we're doing an extract, we're basically taking a pile of compost and pouring a lot of water through it and just soaking it through, and then that water that runs off from the bottom of the compost pile is what we're using as the extract. So that's basically the difference between an extract and a compost tea. When we're talking about teas, a lot of times what we're working with is not so much the nutrients for the tea, but we're actually looking at a lot of the bacteria and microscopic organisms that are in the compost is what we're really trying to pull out of the compost when we're doing a tea. With the extract, we're trying to do more of the nutrients. So, to make tea, doesn't take a whole lot. For the most part, all we're needing is some compost. Doesn't have to be a lot. Some agricultural molasses. And what this molasses is actually for is food for the microbes, because we're going to be feeding them so they can reproduce a lot while we're making the tea. A burlap bag of some sort, doesn't have to be burlap, could be an old t-shirt or something like that. Something that can hold the compost without a lot of it flowing out through it. So things like cheesecloth probably is going to be a little bit too loose because it'll actually, you'll get a lot of compost that'll leak out through it. So we want something that's fairly substantial to actually not let the compost get out, but will allow the water to flow through reasonably easily. Bucket to make the tea in, an air pump. So if any of you have fish, the little fish bubblers that you get, that's what we're looking for when we talk about an air pump, which I'll talk about here, why we need that in a second. The other thing that we need is water. And this can be one of the more interesting issues that we've run into. Tap water won't work. Tap water, by its very nature, when we're buying water from the City of Abilene or any of the local water sources, that water has been treated with chlorine or ammonia or chloramides. And chloramides are the ones that are really detrimental for us because it's a chlorine, but it's also got I don't know the exact makeup of it, but it's designed to have what they call residuals. It means it has the killing power of the chlorine that stays for several days. Okay, well, that chlorine killing off the bacteria, well, we're trying to grow bacteria. So we can't have the tap water being used for the compost tea. So we need to use either well water or rainwater if we're going to try and make compost tea. Yes, sir?
Water off your air conditioner works pretty good too.
Yeah, that would be a clean source also.
How do you get a constant source? So
Yeah, and with the way the temperatures are right now, you can probably fill up a 5-gallon bucket in about 3 hours. So to go ahead and make compost tea, we'll take our compost, put it in our little bag, get it all prepped and ready. Need about 4 or 5 cups, so you're looking at a couple handfuls worth of compost. Need about a tablespoon of molasses per cup of compost, so we're talking 4 or 5 tablespoons of molasses. Put it all in the bag, seal up the bag, and then hang the bag over the edge of the bucket. Fill the bucket up with water. Then add your aeration, your little air pump. Now, one of the things I suggest we use is you can get the little air stone bubblers when you go to like a pet store or something, and you get the little air pump to add in. Just make sure you get a little air stone on there. And those air stones, you can just kind of set them down on the bottom of your bucket, and it'll air bubble right through the bag that you have all the compost in. Turn on the aerator and let it sit and run for a couple days. Usually going to want to run it about 1 to 3 days. After about 3 days, that molasses that we had been using as food gets used up by the bacteria. And so anything beyond about 3 days, we're starting to lose that bacteria that we're trying to build up in that compost tea. Once brewed, if we're going to be doing it as a foliar spray, we're probably going to want to go ahead and filter it either through like a cheesecloth or, maybe just kind of a simple filter so that it kind of gets any of the clumps out, so we make sure that it's nice, clean water, or tea in this case, to go into your sprayer so it doesn't clog up any nozzles. And then the key thing about this, you usually want to use it within the first 24 hours. Okay? The reason for this is once you get past about that first 24 hours, the microbial activity, a lot of those microbes are dying off very quickly. So we want to kind of use them while they're still alive. Nice thing about foliar sprays, which I keep mentioning, we can use it as a fungicide. And it's one of the few organic fungicides that we actually have out there. And so if you have things like powdery mildew on your cucumbers, this is one of the good ways to go ahead and spray it down with compost tea, and it'll wipe out the powdery mildew. Okay. Other things that, strawberries are notorious for having problems with needing fungicides, and strawberries, finding organic strawberries is almost impossible, true organic strawberries, because they use various forms of fungicides that, they're chemically based, but they're marketed as organic. So, but using compost tea, you can actually use as a true organic fungicide. Works well on things like black spot, especially on roses, or brown spots in the lawn. There's I believe brown spots, I think it's in St. Augustine ground. That's a virus in the St. Augustine, if I remember right. I'm not sure on that. And it works well to actually help kill that off. You can also use it to revive dead soil. Now, like I said, if you're doing it to revive dead soil, usually you're going to want to use more of an extract as opposed to the tea, but either one will work. Most of us will sit there at the end of the gardening season if we have any pots that we had plants in. They die off in the winter. We just kind of sit there and leave the pots in a storage shed or in the garage or whatnot. Soil dries out completely, turns into little hard bricks. Well, that hard brick has lost all of its microbial activity in the soil. And that really is where a lot of the plant gets its nutrients from, is through the microbial activity in the soil. And so we really need to recharge that. And that's one of the good things for compost tea, is we take some of that dead soil that we have, water it down with a compost tea, and we get healthy soil back. Let's see. Oh.
How often would you spray or water the pots with?
As needed. Now, if you're talking about trying to revive soil, once you've revived the soil and it's back to a healthy soil, it's good to go as long as it hasn't dried out. But if you're going to actually boost it a little bit with some compost tea or anything like that, it depends on what you're growing in there and how much you're trying to use that pot up. So if it's not a real harsh use of the soil, then you can probably get by with every couple of months without any problem. Just wanted to show you one thing I skipped over with looking at it. As you notice, when it bubbles up, it gets all kind of bubbly and nasty looking, but that's really what we're looking for. That's a lot of that microbial activity churning off into that compost tea, which is kind of a nice thing. Yes, ma'am.
I was curious, how do you know when your compost can be used for this? Because I've read various things. Sometimes it says 6 months is supposed to be composting. The way to determine if your compost is finished is especially if you're doing a hot compost pile, if you turn it and while it's still nice and moist and it doesn't build up any heat, it's finished. Okay. Build up heat.
Yeah. So that's one of the key things. The other thing to look at is the compost broken down to the point where you can't identify any of the original constituents in it. Some of my compost pile, when you turn them, you'll see little shreds of paper in it or something along those lines. And it's not quite ready. Let it sit for a little bit longer until it looks completely like soil.
Some things take longer to break down, though, like paints and things like that.
Yeah, especially I use a lot of times as my base for a lot of my browns is actually wood chips. I've got a really good free source for wood chips, and so those take a long time. In fact, I usually let my compost piles run about a year for big wood chips to break down fully. So, any other questions? No more.
Is there any bad impact if you don't let it go long enough?
The one problem you'll have on compost, if it's a hot compost pile that it hasn't finished yet, it will be called what they call hot. It's not quite finished. It's got a little bit, if you put it on your plants, it can burn the plants a little bit. So that's the one big problem with that.
You could bury it under several layers of soil, that'd be fine, right?
It would actually be better if you lay it as a top dressing and let it work its way in so that it wasn't quite so hot. So.
How does fertilizer affect the grass?
Which type of fertilizer? I mean, just generic fertilizer?
With weed killer, in this case, he would have weed killer in our fertilizer.
Okay. So you're looking at a weed and feed type fertilizer? We, as master gardeners, don't recommend weed and feed fertilizers. The big problem with that is when you're putting your fertilizer down is the time when the weeds are starting to grow, but your grass usually isn't. And so you're feeding the weeds
that you're trying to kill. So it makes they don't work quite as well. We recommend that if you're going to do a product, you use fertilizer when you're supposed to, which is usually after your second regular mowing of your grass, before you actually add any fertilizer. And then if you do weed treatments, do them as strictly as a weed treatment. But if you're using like a broadleaf weed killer in your grass, I would not recommend putting the grass clippings into your compost pile. Yeah.
Because I'm too nervous about the weed killer.
Yeah.
If I'm going to use it in my flower beds,
Yeah, and that's the thing. You know, the weed killers, especially 2,4-D, is very persistent, and it will transfer through compost piles and everything else. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
How long does it take for glyphosate to break down?
I don't have any good research on that. I do know that the effectiveness of the glyphosate to killing things is pretty much immediate. If it's either going to, it's a contact killer, so when it hits a plant, it kills the plant. If it hits the soil, it's inert for killing things. Now, that's for plants. Now, whether there's an issue with long-term use, especially for around human contact, they're starting to finally do some studies on that to determine if there are actually going to be any issues for us. I haven't seen any good science on that one way or the other yet, unfortunately. Yes, ma'am.
Have you found a book that's good to recommend for the worm process? Website?
I do have one, but I don't remember what the name of it. Let my wife know, and I'll send you an email with the name. Any other questions? All right. Thank you all for coming. We do.